Welcome to Dedicated. I'm your host, Doug Brunt. Today, it's my honor to have Linda Fairstein with us. She is an attorney and best-selling author. She was the founder and head of the Sex Crimes Unit of the Manhattan DA's office from 1976 to 2002. She's also the author of 24 books, 20 books in the Alex Cooper crime series, which is Alex Cooper is a prosecutor for the Manhattan Attorney's Office. So Linda draws on her vast firsthand experience to write those novels. Linda, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming in.
Just a joy for me to be here on a book show. So thank you.
We need more book shows, as we were just discussing.
Me in my youth, and it's fabulous that you do this. It's so interesting to watch other authors talk about their work, and you bring it all out.
Well, thanks. Well, and as you know, one of the bargains in all this is we all get a cocktail to start out, and like Alex Cooper, we're going to drink a little Dewar scotch.
We are.
And also like our mutual friend, Nelson DeMille, when I was actually setting up the bar, I realized I don't drink a lot of scotch. And so this is the same bottle that Nelson and I shared a drink. And Nelson's a dear friend, and you go back with Nelson far longer than I do. So I thought we could have a little toast to Nelson, too.
Great idea. I misread it.
It was a beautiful service for Nelson that where you and I reconnected.
Yes. And I thought the priest, by making it so personal, it was an unusual mass ceremony.
Yeah.
And he talked about the fact that he never read one of Nelson's books and how that upset Nelson. So that rang very true.
And so I think he agreed. He went out and bought Cathedral, I think, was the one he decided he would read of Nelson. So, well,
Alex never drank in the middle of the day, but I'm not Alex, so here we go.
Well, to our dear friend Nelson.
Yes.
Cheers.
You got the good stuff. You got the 12.
Dewar's 12. So we'll start at the beginning. You were born in Westchester County, New York. Is that right?
It was actually Mount Vernon. So
Mount Vernon.
It's not fancy Westchester the way people think of it, but yes, born and raised and educated in Mount Vernon.
I just passed that on my train. Mount Vernon East is the stop that I hit on the New Haven line. And
we were central, so Fleetwood, which is part of Mount Vernon, and always took the Hudson line.
Okay. And I read you also went to Vassar,
yes,
and then finished up probably right around the time Vassar became co-ed, I think.
So I was the last all-women's class at Vassar, and we had a few guys in the years behind us, and then it completely became co-ed, yeah.
And then ironically, you go off to UVA Law, where I read you were one of 12 women in your class. You go from basically all women to very few women in your law school class.
This is correct. I was very smart. Enough in Poughkeepsie 4 years of just women. But it was also what law schools were doing at that time. I mean, there were just handful of other graduate schools as well. But they accepted 18 women in my class at UVA Law with about 340 men. And we were down to 12 by the end of 6 months.
Wow.
And, yeah.
So what is that? Like 5%, less than 5%, something like that. That's amazing.
Yes. Very, very odd time.
I had to do the math early before we had too much scotch.
Good. And I didn't attempt it at all. But it was just, a very different environment. I mean, with all women.
Did you guys have to sort of close ranks as women? Are you in touch with some of these women still?
So, yeah, my closest friend died very prematurely. But yes, I'm in touch with some. And when I was at Rancho Mirage at the Writers Festival, where we had been together last, one of my classmates who now lives in Palm Springs showed up with her husband.
Oh, that's nice.
So yes, I do stay in touch with some of the women.
I mean, that really is going through something to be a dozen women graduating from a class of more than 300.
Well, what was so unusual was in my classes at Vassar, I mean, it was nothing to be called on and asked to talk. And I mean, often women who'd had a big weekend would come to class in their pajamas with a trench coat on. I mean, it was that kind of thing.
Right.
And at UVA, it was a different point in time. So one of my professors would do something called Ladies' Day. And he'd just walk in the class and he'd say with a deep bourbon-soaked Southern accent, "Today is Ladies' Day, and ladies stand up." And there would be 3 of us in the class, and I would turn scarlet, and we just had to stand for the whole hour while he asked questions
Of only the ladies.
Only the ladies. But you could no more do that today, or probably 5 years after that. But it was a very tough change.
Well, I mean, I guess that prepped you, for what came next, because, that nothing tougher than going to the sex crimes unit of the Manhattan DA's office. So you went right from UVA to the Manhattan DA's office. There was no lure of big bucks on, corporate litigation.
There was the lure of it, but I really was about public service. It's what interested me when I was in law school. And the Manhattan DA's office, the Manhattan DA was Frank Hogan. No, but none of your listeners will remember him, but he had already served about 26 years when I applied. And before, again, the EEOC, and then I'll drop this thread, you were allowed to say to women, why do you think you belong in this office? He thought it was not an appropriate place for women because of the violence. And so he put the women in the law library.
Well, then, so you arrive in Manhattan in 72. By 76, you're promoted to head the sex crimes unit. So was he the one who promoted you?
No, he died, unfortunately. He died about 18 months after I got there. He was interim DA, and then Bob Morgenthau was elected in 75. And the unit had just started as an experiment before Bob was elected. And he asked me to take it over. And I said, I don't think so, Mr. Morgenthau. I'm just trying a wide variety of crimes, my first murder case. I don't think I want a steady diet of one kind of very difficult crime. And I walked out of his office, and the chief assistant, who's a federal judge now, John Keenan, stopped me and said, this is not a yes or no answer.
You're doing it.
And it was the time of The Godfather. And he said, you can't refuse. So I turned around, went back in and say, I'd like to give it a try. And I was 29. There had been no sex crimes units in the country. The laws were archaic.
Yeah.
And we had a little team that he let me put together, and we went out and really carved a new kind of law.
Yeah, and so the audience knows this really is Law and Order SVU. This is what you basically found, and the show is truly modeled after how you guys did it here in Manhattan.
Totally. Dick Wolf called and said, this is what I'm doing. We get no royalties for it, but...
did they come shadow you for a period of time?
They did at the beginning. They did at the beginning, both Mariska Hargitay and Stephanie March, who was my role, the prosecutor, Alex Cabot.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So prior to you establishing this and developing, I assume, a big book of best practices that other cities then followed, how was it done? It just got spread across the entire DA's office, so no one was really expert in handling these peculiar kinds of cases?
Well, what you've said is exactly right. There was no expertise, but the other point is that the laws were so archaic that very few of these cases could even get into court. Our laws in New York, when I started to do this, required what's called corroboration, and basically meant there had to be an eyewitness to this crime that was least likely to be witnessed. You could have homicides, 10 people looking on the street, and bank robberies. So corroboration was a huge problem. This is more than a decade before DNA. So identifying the assailant was often very hard, if not impossible in these cases. And then you had to have proof of force. So if a woman said, the guy had a knife and he held it to my neck, so I submitted, she was deemed to have consented because she didn't allow herself to be stabbed. There was no proof of force unless he was caught with the knife in his hand. It was crazy. I mean, they were laws from 17th century England, really 17th century England. So, and pretty much everywhere in the country.
Which city was next to develop a dedicated sex crimes unit?
So, pockets. Seattle, Washington had one, I think, before LA. And then LA and a lot of the cities began to call and say, can we come in and see what you're doing? Can we read your legislative proposals for changes in the law? Can we see what techniques you're using? So there were 4 of us in my unit, and we welcomed people in, and we wanted this to work. We wanted badly for this to work.
And what year did Dick Wolf come in and start shadowing you to, pursue this idea of SVU?
When did that show start? Good question. Like, I think around 98, 99.
Okay.
Before, he had the idea, and he may have had his first script, and then he said, is it okay? Can I send Mariska down to meet you and shadow you?
That's cool. That's amazing. So around that time as well, I'll hold up your debut novel, Final Jeopardy 1996.
Right.
Which is fascinating. I know, so both you and Scott Turow were practicing lawyers when you were big star authors as well. And it always fascinates me to wonder, what was the judge thinking when you stroll into the courtroom as his, best-selling author? And, it's like this celebrity status inside the courtroom. Because so you had a number of years while you were still at the DA's office while you were writing these terrific novels too.
Well, thank you. And Scott is one of my favorite. I think Presumed Innocent is as good as it gets, even though the victim is a dead sex crimes prosecutor. But we've joked about that many times. At the beginning, everybody, when I said I was doing this, I got the permission of the DA, and I got the permission actually of the ethics board of the city of New York. I didn't want anybody to claim I was doing something I shouldn't do. And the ethics board said, as long as you're doing it on your own time and not city time, that's fine. And they said, as I was walking out the room, the head of the ethics committee said, everybody thinks they can write a novel. And good luck. So that was the way I left it, and I started to write. And nobody thought, me included, that it was going to break through and work. So at first, my colleagues, the DAs, and the judges would joke about it, those who knew I was doing it. And by the third book, when it was working, and I made the bestseller list, guys would come up to me at the end of the day and said, I had this really good idea for a scene, like with a character like me who was in court today, and I said this great thing to the judge. I've got the transcript. And some people, not everybody, but some of my friends wanted to be characters in the book.
Yeah.
And
that's
they
great. That's awesome. I know Nelson, speaking of Nelson again, he would sometimes auction off for charity the rights to, name a character in the book and things like that. I love the blurbs on here. You've got Patricia Cornwell.
Yes.
Prior guest of the show.
Yep.
Dominic Dunn, we were just talking about as well. And I picked this up because I wonder what the first sentence and first paragraph that Linda ever published was, and it's so good. Do you mind if I read it just quickly?
Thank you.
I have actually never done this on the show before because I don't really believe in author readings. I feel like they're awkward, but this was so good I want to read it. I sat on my living room sofa at 5 o'clock in the morning with a copy of the mock-up of the front page of the day's New York Post in my hand, looking at my own obituary. The headline I was reading had been prepared hours earlier when the cops thought it was my head that had been blown apart by a rifle blast on a quiet country road in a little Massachusetts town called Chilmark. It's great. It just sets it up. I'm not a great reader of people's books, but that is so good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Especially for your first sentence published is really amazing out of the gates.
Worked hard on it. And actually it was drawn from the fact that Greta Scacchi, who was the
actress,
but the alive actress, but the dead prosecutor in Presumed Innocent, was being stalked when she was filming a movie around town, and she came to us and we helped her, and I offered her the house that my husband and I had on the vineyard because it was out of season, and my husband kept saying, "Are you crazy? I mean, there's nobody there, and if someone were to find out that she's in that house, that would be a great place to stalk her and hurt her." And so I quickly withdrew the offer, but it's what percolated to be the idea for a scene.
Book. Yeah. And then 20 books later, we've got Blood Oath here, which I'll hold up as well. The 20th in the Alex Cooper series. All, I don't know how many bestsellers in there, how many millions of books sold, but incredible.
Yeah. It was,
and great material to pull from.
Always. I never wrote real cases, but I drew from motives. I drew from issues about crimes. And then, except for book one, it became my branding to do some aspect of New York City history so the reader would learn something. And Blood Oath, named for a small batch bourbon called Blood Oath, is set in large part in Rockefeller University in the hospital there that was built in 1911 by John D. Rockefeller, to cure infectious disease because he had a grandson who died of yellow fever.
Oh, okay. Well, I also wanted to ask you about some of our other mutual friends. And what was the year? See, this was 96, the debut.
Yes.
And then you also started a fascinating book group with Mary Higgins Clark and Harlan Coben and Nelson and a number of others. Can you?
Lee Child.
Lee Child.
Yes. Yeah. So it was actually the wonderful Mary Higgins Clark who started the dinner club for writers. And she had started it long before some of us had been writing books with some writers who long before had died. Dorothy Salisbury. There was a bunch of mystery writers. And so they met regularly, kind of like an Algonquin writers roundtable. And as the old ones either retired or shuffled off their mortal coils, Mary began to ask other people to join. And Nelson before me and Lee before me, and I think Harlan and I were probably classmates. And Mary's wonderful daughter, who also died prematurely, Carol Higgins Clark, was in it. Linda Stasi, Susan Isaacs, Tom Cook, who's a really wonderful mystery writer. And we would get together once a month for dinner. And the idea was to discuss craft.
At a restaurant or at a home?
At a restaurant. And we made Mary change restaurants. A couple of us made her change restaurants. We began going to Michael's. We needed a round table. And we had been at a restaurant. I won't mention the name, but it was a little shabby and couldn't really get a good drink, not to mention eat. So some of us suggested Michael's, which is a very writerly hangout during publishing biz hangout during the day. And we'd go for dinner and we'd discuss craft. We'd discuss if somebody had run into a problem, like what were you blocked about for those who got blocked. And then Mary would always say, "What are you working on now? Let's go around the table." And really we became friends as a group. And then in that group, some of us became closer than others. I mean, Harlan and I had a great friendship, and Nelson and I bonded. And it was just a wonderful way. I felt like such a grown-up being invited into this mystery world.
Did you ever pull something out of one of those that made it into a book, or it helped you overcome a block of your own, or you helped someone else overcome a block?
We talked about blocks, I must say, because I had a full-time job or a more than full-time prosecutorial job. I never allowed myself to have block. I'd literally keep on writing through. Sometimes I tore up the pages a day or two later, but I would force myself to move forward and tell a story. And we tried to help each other. I mean, I know I talked to other people through plotting. But
would people share stories about agents or publishers or crazy stuff that happened at a book festival? Or
Oh, yes. All of the above.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone had a problem with their agent or had a particularly good relationship and someone else was looking for an agent. Publishers, I mean, at one time when I started writing, there were 22 publishing houses in New York. They've all been chewed up by now. Now Simon & Schuster is the mother house, and you may have 15 imprints that were once their own
but you're all under
companies,
the roof of
but
Simon.
you were under that S&S roof.
Yeah.
So, yes, we all tried to be helpful with that kind of thing. We put each other into book festivals. I remember the first time Mary Higgins Clark and I were together at a signing, and there used to be something called New York is Book Country, and they'd close Fifth Avenue, Upper Fifth, for the better part of a Sunday, and they'd set up tables, and 56th to 57th was always Mystery Row. And so they'd have been, and your time was, for example, 12 to 2. And so Mary was at the same table I was, and she probably had 1,200 books stacked up, and I had 15 copies of Final Jeopardy. And her line went to Park Avenue from Fifth, and she'd say she'd lean over and look at her line of waiting readers, and she'd say, Linda's a very nice person. Why don't you come over here and buy one of her books and then get back in line here?
Nice.
I mean, which was just, she was the most gracious of people.
That's funny. That reminds me, when I first met Nelson, I got invited to the Union League Book Fair, which I'm sure you've done with Nelson, because it's he's the member who sponsors this book festival at the Union League in New York. And it was the same thing. I was there with my debut novel. You really, I hate those kinds of formats for the things because it's basically 100 authors sitting around, in that case, maybe 40. Mm-hmm. And people come and they sort of walk around and you're sitting there like a zoo animal. You know, they may or may not stop at your table and your book, and then they'll ask you, tell me about the book, and you have to tell them about the book. The line for Nelson, of course, is 200 people long. Everyone else has 5 to 10, and then there are like the people like me who had 0 to 1. And anyway, afterwards, he and I had a drink at the bar and became friends. But that was back in 12, so you know, more than 10 years after you and Nelson were hanging out. So.
Right, but you didn't invite me for a drink that night. But I was probably there too. And the great thing about that Union League thing was it's their Christmas party to raise money for employees' kids for scholarships. And so people came, they had to pay a ticket to get in the room. And then there was lots to drink. There were a couple of bars and people would start walking around and say, "Oh, Doug, seems like a nice young man. You know, Aunt Mary would read this," and they'd buy 3 and 4.
There are a few sympathy purchases.
Yeah, that's all right.
We'll take them any way we can get them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any other crazy stories coming out of those Michael's dinners?
Really, nothing crazy. There were the occasional. There were some moments when people, Mary would go on and on about her 37th book and something great happening, and there were some guys that couldn't get another book published at the moment, so
not enjoying her.
Not enjoying the great, loving her, but not enjoying the great stories. But they were pretty light. I mean, fun light dinners.
Well, incredible success coming out of that table. If you think of, you know, if Harlan joined in like 96, 7, 8. I mean, he's gone on to do amazing things. Lee Child, amazing things. You know, these were not big names in the late 90s.
No.
I think they both. Maybe all 3 of you had your debut in 96 then, something like that.
Pretty close to that. And Harlan's first books, look at him now, were paperback originals. And I remember when Tell No One was a huge deal because it was a hardcover. Yeah. And so it's wonderful to look back. And
I remember he told me at one point the advance on his first book was something like $5,000, you know, which is like barely pays for your parking in a month.
Exactly.
Crazy.
So much for all the great author stories, but he's made up for it. And as you say, he's got more TV movies than anybody I can think of.
That's right. Yeah, I read something like he's king of Netflix. There was some article that called him king of Netflix. That's actually good. I wanted to ask you about some Netflix and other things and the blurred lines between fiction and nonfiction. And you actually mentioned you draw, of course, from your vast experience, and then you write fiction. These days, there are such a rash of these things called docu-series where it touches on, I don't know, it grabs real people, real events, and then it's like almost posing as a documentary, but not. And I think you're a great person to ask about this because you have been through this experience on the other end of it, wherein in 2019, Netflix did this docu-series called When They See Us by Anna DuVernay about the Central Park Five, which is an event from the 80s. And you were at the DA's office at that time. And they attributed words and actions to you that you say and didn't neither said nor did.
Correct.
And so you sued. And
for defamation.
Sued for defamation. The judge looking into this went to DuVernay and said, well, where's your source material for these scenes where Linda said and did these things? Her response was, well, it's not a documentary. And to which I'm sure the judge then assumed, so there is no source material to support these scenes. Netflix had a statement arguing, in the gist of their argument was there needs to be leeway and that artistic leeway and that these kinds of things shouldn't be held to a journalistic standard. So I think the judge is seeing all this, and of course it settled, and the settlement required Netflix to pay $1 million to the Innocence Project, and they had to change the messaging when you stream this. Up front, the messaging now says inspired by and fictionalized, events are fictionalized here. So
because DuVernay admitted, actually, that she invented is the word she used, my dialogue, and invented my actions. So that was a big part of the judge's decision in refusing to dismiss the case.
So she did say the word invented, which is just amazing to me that it's even positioned anywhere near the documentary category. So I was wondering if you could talk about reputation, and the responsibility for an artist, whether it's a writer or a filmmaker, in how they treat their projects that handle real people and real events?
I think the simplistic part of it is, had Netflix and DuVernay and Locke not used my name, had they said, Jane Doe did this, that, and the other, I wouldn't have had a lawsuit. They billed it as a true story.
Even if they used real names all around you and had your real title, just with a different name?
I would have had a very rough time.
That'd be a pretty thin veneer.
It was a pretty thin veneer, thin ice, as it were. But they just took the liberty, and again, there's something called discovery in a trial and pretrial process, in which all of this came out. The emails, the Netflix executives asking, did she really do those things? She, being Fairstein, really do those things? And no, I invented it because I figured that's what she would be like. Mm-hmm. Somebody who never met me. I was not
Netflix
the prosecutor
was
case.
Surprised even at the extent to which she was inventing.
Yeah, but they got right in bed, but they didn't put a stop to it. They didn't change anything.
They knew that only upon the defamation lawsuit, or they knew that even when it was in production?
They knew that because there was, in fact, a real documentary about the case. Mm-hmm. And again, I was not the prosecutor. I didn't take the statements from the young men involved. And there was an ABC documentary about 6 months before this one aired. And the Netflix executives wrote to DuVernay and said,
this
Fairstein isn't even in
in
this one. It doesn't look like she had a role.
Yeah.
And DuVernay chose not to read, said she wouldn't read the real transcripts. She wouldn't read the case record, all of which is public record. Anybody listening can go on and find the record of the trial. And
so what was her inspiration for the invention? Like, how did she even get onto your name? She just decided, this is the character I'm going to have represent these.
I can't tell you because I don't know her, but I would think because I was the visible person, I was the known name as a best-selling author, and the other characters who really worked on the case weren't known to anybody, and it was just a good way to take a shot at me.
It seems so irresponsible, and I feel like I see it every time. So now when I turn into Netflix and I hear, so there's this term, you know it, docu-series, which is like, I don't know if it's documentary light or what that even means, but it's not a documentary.
Correct.
And it's all over the place. There's this one out now that's getting some buzz on the Menendez brothers. And they've basically invented, as best I can tell, they've invented an incestuous relationship between the brothers for which there is no evidence. It's based on Dominic Dunn's interpretation of what may have happened. And so they've put it in this thing, but now everyone's watching this thing thinking
this is the way it goes. Because as soon as they use the word docu, and so the bastardized words are docudrama and docu-series, they're not saying documentary. But nobody's really, the viewer said, oh, docu-series, docudrama must be real.
Is it just a legal get-out-of-jail-free card? Because it's still using real events, real people. You can take this all the way to The Crown, that show.
Yes.
Which is using, Prince Charles is in some place and in history, he went to that place on that date. And then they have Prince Charles do all these things that he never did. If I were Prince Charles, I'd be like, this is nuts. None of that happened. I was there on that date, but this whole thing is invented.
Yes. And they've got Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip in their bedroom having conversations.
Yeah.
And obviously nobody knows what those were. And
that one actually, to its credit, to some extent, holds itself out there as a fictionalized thing. Like, we're just having a show here. But it gets to that blur. So there's almost a scale of these blurred lines.
But they did that late. And you may recall the Queen was dying when episode 5 or 6 aired. And the royal family didn't sue, but sort of begged Netflix, with Dame Judi Dench leading the charge with the royal family, to put a disclaimer on the film. And Netflix wouldn't. And that was what the Netflix lawyers kept telling our lawyers was such a big loss for them in this case because it was the first time they had to put a disclaimer at the front of a docuseries, docudrama.
So, sorry, but that was a suit, or that was someone just sort of advocated for them to do that?
We said
That was illegal.
Our side said you'd better do that.
I mean, in your case,
yes,
yeah.
But theirs was just a request from
a request. Has anyone else sued besides you, to your knowledge?
Oh yeah, and Netflix has more than 19 lawsuits. I think the next highest about docuseries might be HBO or Max, which have 2 or 3. So there's a new one that's controversial now, Baby Reindeer.
Yes.
They've sued.
By the way, I watched that. That was like, have you seen that?
No.
Oh my God, it's nuts.
Okay, it sounds like a
dark,
nuts story.
But, it was captivating, but gross. And I did hear there was something.
Yes.
Someone came out of the woodwork on that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just know that we've been getting a lot of calls, my lawyers and I, about how we handled Netflix. But
has anyone else successfully sued? I mean, you're settled, and I would say the settlement is a success for you.
Would too.
By far, a reputational slam dunk success for you.
Thank you.
Has anyone else successfully sued?
Do you remember The Queen's Gambit, the movie The Queen,
about chess.
the Russian chess player? Yeah. So there is an 80-something-year-old woman whose name escapes me, Russian, and in the movie, a single line says that there was never a woman grandmaster who defeated a male grandmaster. And this woman, Nina Aniashvili, I mean, it's a name that I'm wrecking, actually did. And she sued, and it was one line, and they knew they'd gotten it wrong, and they just immediately settled and changed the line or removed the line.
All right, so
but others I don't know about
the breach there.
Yeah,
and they actually paid money.
Paid $5 million.
So I have in my notes here that HBO had a statement too. There's another one of these docudrama series things on the Lakers called Legacy, and HBO had a statement saying it was it's quote fictionalized in part for dramatic purposes. So it needs a new name. Like I think docu needs to be out of it. It's just fiction.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. They're just fictional TV series, whatever those should be called. But docu,
still, it's because I mean, The Crown is not. I don't think they ever should put docu. I'm not sure that's enough. It's all real names.
Yeah.
The Legacy thing on the Lakers. It's all events that we know with some percentage invented. We don't know which percentage. And some of it is reputationally damaging to people.
Yes.
I don't know what the way forward is there.
I don't either, but I'd like to work on one with whoever wants to work with me.
So as far as you know, there are 2 successful suits, yours and the one on the Queen's Gambit.
I think there were a couple of others. I remember studying this during the pendency of our lawsuit because when my lawyer wrote to me and said there are actually 19 lawsuits against Netflix, and the next highest is 2, next highest company. I was shocked and began going through them, and I think maybe 2 were thrown out. There's a movie called Inventing Anna, which is about a Cuban refugee. I think that's still pending. A couple were thrown out, and I think a couple may have been settled with not a non-disclosure of what the settlement was.
Yeah. Well, let's shift gears into your writing process. Because, I know you do draw on your work experience. How similar is it to prepare a legal brief to preparing a novel? I know, and especially in those early years, 96, you're still working. As you say, you must be working insane hours. I can only imagine. Grisham, you, others are lawyers into novelists.
Yep.
Writing on trains or whenever catch can.
Scott, yep.
And but did you find it similar when you sat down to write the book versus writing, preparing your cases?
The thing that was so liberating, Doug, about writing the books was with my cases, I was bound by the facts and the law. I mean, there were no liberties to be taken. You had to follow the law, and you had to use only the facts that you had. And here I am at home, and usually I would write early morning before going to work. The day was over. Once I have one of these, there's no writing. So just to find that the creative process that I could make up something that had happened, as opposed to being bound by the law. I mean, the facts were my facts. They came from within my head, my brain. So much more liberating to write fiction. Harder because it was in a different way. I mean, just the creating something and peopling the characters in a book, and then figuring out what the twists are, and are they reasonable and are they logical, and then getting to an ending. Nothing worse in a crime novel than an unsatisfying conclusion. Yeah. So it was a genre I'd always lived in and read widely. The people before me, all my competitors, because you just learn from doing it. And you learn what you don't like and what you do, and sort of trying to.
When you left to become full-time, did that change? So there's that urgency when you're working. I've got an hour. I've got to make, and as you say, I had to push through. When you left, was it different when you suddenly, this is my job. I've got to wake up and I've got to do this. I don't have this other job that's distracting me. I'm writing bestsellers now.
It was entirely as life-altering as I had expected it to be. I could take a coffee break. I could take a walk, swim in the middle of the day if I was somewhere warm where I like to be. So very, very different. I always did consulting. It was one way of keeping a finger in it, but it was just also what I loved. So I always had a business of consulting around the country on sexual assault cases, but I had the time to spend all day, every day writing.
Was that too much of a luxury all of a sudden?
It was a great luxury. It was fun at last.
I mean, all evidence to the contrary, because the books are amazing and you were selling more and more bestsellers. So
but I was getting them done on time. Yeah. Part of it, reminded only by talking to you, was that my first deadlines, because the DA's job came first, I often didn't meet, and I'd be whining and calling the editor and say, please tell the publisher that, I can't do it in 4 more months. I need X amount of time. Yeah. So it was a complete change, and a very happy one. It's it's kind of the dream, the writer's life, if it's working. It's I mean,
if you're getting paid paid enough to live, to do this is really
and make up stories,
amazing.
And people sometimes want to read them. Yeah.
Just speaking of Harlan, I remember him saying, someone's willing to open up their wallet and pull out 20 books and spend it on something I made up. What a thing. It's an incredible thing.
Yes.
Did you outline the books? Getting sort of deeper into process here, would you outline them up front, or would you just go at it?
So I always did about a 6-chapter outline. And once I started the book and I knew who I was going to kill and the reason why, what world I was in, I knew how it would end. I had to have an ending compulsively, because I hated those shows or books where you get 340 pages in and the door opens like the old Perry Masons, and in comes a character you've never met, and that's the solution. I did it, and that's the solution. So I'd do the murder, I'd solve it in my own head. I didn't necessarily write a chapter. And then I'd outline sort of 6 chapters at a time, and never more than that, because things change. I mean, as you introduce a character, I needed a defense attorney in one of the books, and I really wanted the best, silver-tongued, really good defense attorney who could run circles around my prosecutorial character, Alex Cooper. And I just loved him. So he was supposed to be a minor character in one book. And then I said, I'm keeping this guy's a keeper. I mean, he's going to come back, and he's going to be in more books. So that kind of
happened to Thoreau as well, right? With,
yes. The Sandy Stern character.
Sandy Stern, right.
So it's so I'd outline a few chapters at a time, and then I'd do the next 5, the next 6, because something would have happened. I'd introduce somebody. I'd think of another suspect, and so I never did the white wall as many of my friends do, where from here to there are index cards, and the whole book is outlined that way.
Yeah. How about editing? Did you edit as you go? I mean, it's funny. My wife, as a lawyer, will say, if I had more time, I'd have written a shorter brief, as an ex-lawyer for her. So, big on the editing, redrafting a million times. Did you edit as you as you wrote, or sort of sprint to the finish and edit later?
I wanted to sprint, but what I did every day was wake up and edit the pages I did before. I'd start a few pages 2 days before, and then I'd read it to see if the flow was good, to see if it made any sense. And as I said earlier, there are days I just rip up what I had written. It just didn't make sense, or it was just
those
sour
are painful
day.
moments.
Oh
You
my
just
God,
know
ripping
it's
up
not-
anything,
Oh.
right? Yeah. Yes, the vanity of that. But yeah, so so I would do that literally every day. And then sometimes I get
It's a nice way to get started. Just sort of get
It is.
loose. Just read the prior day's work.
correct.
Kind of gets you in the flow a little bit.
Yes. And that's, I think it's Hemingway who said, who never left at the end of like, I'm compulsive. I would like to end like a chapter period, end of. And he said, I always leave in the middle of a thought or a sentence so that when I get up the next day, I'm not starting with a blank screen. I can get right
A place
into
to
it.
pick up.
And
Yeah.
I kind of, not in his fashion, but I loved to do that, to just be able to wake up, have my coffee, and get right into the pages.
That's true. Starting is the hardest part.
Yes.
Any trick to help that?
Yep.
How about early readers? Are there people you would show early drafts to? Would you even show chapters, or you sort of finish it and then show the finished?
Great
And is there
question.
anyone that you trust to do that?
Great question. So I have had 2 wonderful marriages. My first husband was a good bit older and lived a great long life and died. And then I married my best friend from law school, they were good friends. A weird enough story, but they each get the early read, and they're both critical. I mean, it's which is good in the
need
long
that,
run.
yeah.
And it was not good at the end of a long day. You know, if I'd done an incredibly difficult scene, and somebody sits there and then puts the X's through, like, doesn't work for me or whatever. And my editor, Colin Harrison, who's a great novelist as well at Scribner, had this practice of he'd put the criticisms, but then he used a green pencil and he'd put a check mark. And I said, what's the green pencil? And he said, that check mark means good. I really like it. I like the line of dialogue.
Nice.
So
Let's do
I
more of that. I would
went
like to see
out and
that
got
from my
my
editors.
husband a green pencil. And I said, criticize all you want. But every now and then, just check off. That was a good line of dialogue. So, yeah,
That's
they're
so
the
true.
only
So
people who ever
my
saw it.
editor is great, and he'll do the sort of the big picture feedback, and then
Yeah.
also the line edit. And you know, over the course of an entire manuscript, there'll be like 3 like love that line. And I'm like, oh,
Right?
it means so
You
much to
live
me when I get it. It's like, oh, that's so wonderful to hear.
Give him a green pencil.
Yeah.
Tell
So-
him to loosen up.
Megan is one of my early readers,
Yeah.
and she is unsparing in
See,
the criticism.
that's-
You know, like she'll circle whole pages with a big X across it then, and you know, boring or doesn't work or something. It's like, oh God. And I've actually gotten to the point where I trust her, really. I mean, she's very, very good at, you know, it's all storytelling, you know, whether you're doing the news or fiction or nonfiction, or whatever, we're all telling a story. Or you know, litigating a case and talking to a jury. You know, you're telling a story. But I have gotten to the point where I need to corroborate it. Like if she says bad and my editor says bad, I'm like, definitive. It's bad. It's got to go. If it's only one, then it makes me, you know, circle back and reevaluate.
Right.
But I'm not willing to fully let go of something I like unless 2 people I trust say
It's a
bad.
very good idea. I think you're right.
How about, so here's the Nelson DeMille question. Do you type or write by hand?
I started writing by hand. My first book was nonfiction, and there are pictures of me writing by hand because it was my romantic idea of how somebody writes a book. And you know, I would
on a
have
beach in Provence or whatever. Provence is not on a beach, but somewhere.
Right, somewhere. And you know, had I the choice, it would have been a quill pen and ink. That's you know, go back to Jane Austen doing that.
Yeah.
And then I met my first computer, and I stopped doing it by hand and use a computer. And it's just, you can't beat the speed and the delete. And I've never learned how to cut and paste, which is hard to believe, but you know, moving things around.
It eliminates a step.
Yeah.
Too.
Yes.
I think Nelson's big problem is no one could read his handwriting. So
Yes,
it's
he
like
often
one person
said
in
that.
the world who could even do it. Everyone says a number 2, or I've seen it written anywhere that number 2 pencil for Nelson, but I'm pretty sure it was a number 1, which was the softer lead. He would say it felt better in my hand to have the softest lead possible to have a number 1 pencil.
Oh, wow. I don't.
That's really getting into the weeds on Nelson DeMille.
That's okay. We're a man worth getting in the weeds on. Yeah.
So we have Blood Oath here. This is the most recent Alex Cooper. We were talking before we started the show here, you and I offset, that you might have a project stepping to the side, at least briefly, from Alex Cooper. What are you working on now?
Well, my husband and I moved to a little barrier island on the Gulf Coast of Florida 5 years ago. It's called Gasparilla, and it was just devastated in Hurricane Milton. So our house is okay, but the rest of the island is really bad. But living there, it's just an entirely different life. I wouldn't know anybody like Alex Cooper. And so I've been playing with creating a character who is not a prosecutor, not an official law enforcement person, but who has a very different life on a barrier island where bad things happen too.
So we're still in the crime.
Oh yes,
thriller
we're still.
genre,
Yes, we are. We are still in that,
but more on the layperson perspective of things.
Yes, although it used to make me crazy because I never had a crime in 30 years solved by an amateur sleuth, and here I am going amateur sleuth PI direction.
Yeah.
But
will it be set in Florida mainly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then for all the universe of Alex Cooper fans, will there be a 21st?
Yes. So I have open files on both of them. I feel I can't leave Alex and Mike just hanging out there after her last caper. So I will get back to her, but this other life has intervened happily, and so I want to try and play with it.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. And you've written one nonfiction book, too. I think your first book ever was nonfiction.
Correct.
Right?
Sexual Violence, Our War Against Rape, which I was asked to do by a publisher in the late 1980s. And finally finished it, and it was published in 93. Okay. A tougher topic. It was really what we'd accomplished in the law up to that point in time. And it was really the infancy of DNA. I mean, it would be a very different book today.
That's so, and I know, getting back to where we know so many of the same people here, and some of these circles keep coming back in this same conversation, but the Scott Turow Presumed Innocent book, which you mentioned you love, was redone. So they did the movie, they redid it in a show, but because of DNA evidence, they had to redo the whole plot line because it completely upends the way investigations happen now.
Yes. So I think that Presumed Innocent is one of the two best courtroom dramas I've ever read. And I think it's one of the few that really made a great movie first time around. Mm-hmm. And when the series started, Mike and I are great bingers of series, and I just couldn't bear to do the 1 week. So it's one of our fall projects to see the new one, but everybody's raved about it.
Okay, we'll not spoil it for you then. Yeah, so save that.
But I figured that had to be changed.
But I agree that movie was so Brian Dennehy and Raul Julia and of course Harrison Ford and Greta Sachi. It was just the casting. It's one of those movies where everything came together. The casting, it was to the point where you just couldn't imagine it any other way.
That's right. And you see it again, it just holds up so well.
Yeah, we watched that with the kids about a year ago, and it does hold up. It's just as good now.
Yes. Yeah.
Good old Scott Turow. All right, so on to the lightning round.
Okay.
Linda Fairstein, your favorite book as a kid?
Hands down, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I did Nancy Drew. Mm-hmm. I did Hardy Boys because I had an older brother, and I loved those. Not that one book stands out, but when my father, I think I was 11, put Conan Doyle in my hands, and I read them over and over again really every 2-3 years. I just think those stories are great, and he wrote them brilliantly, and he was such an interesting, quirky guy.
So good. And those are great. Hardy Boys is great. I never read Nancy Drew. I might pick one up just to know it because it comes up from time to time. But Would you hand me your children's book too? I want to hold that up because
it's an homage to the Nancy Drew series.
Yes, the Devlin Quick Mysteries. So this is also by Linda Fairstein. I have not read this, but I'm going to give this to my kids.
Yep, they're sort of 9 to 12. So Devlin Quick is a very New York City kid, unlike the Hardy Boys and Nancy. And her mother is the first woman police commissioner of New York City, which gives her access to things in headquarters that she shouldn't have access to, like facial recognition software. And the guys all help her.
What year did this come out?
That came out in 2016.
Okay.
And they were just great fun to write. I wrote 3 of them. Great fun to write. And it delighted me to do. And as you may know, did you ever know there was no Carolyn Keene and no Franklin W. Dixon?
No, I did not. It did become sort of like a pan name for a number, because the Hardy Boys books were written over decades. So Franklin W. Dixon was actually just like a name attributed to like, it's like in Glamour magazine, Jake a Man's View. There have been like 9 Jakes.
Right. Well, same thing.
My friend was one of the Jakes. He was Jake for like 2 years.
Well, I was at a party in D.C. and a well-known woman reporter, who I'm sure you and Megan know, we were talking over our drinks, and she said, I was just in an auction today and I bought Carolyn Keene's desk. And my husband's kicking me and said, don't do it. Don't go there. And I had to just say, there was no Carolyn Keene. I don't know whose desk you bought, but it wasn't Carolyn Keene's. So I just love those. I loved those as a kid. But a whole new level. I mean, the Sherlock Holmes stories are so brilliant.
Yeah.
And so well written.
Okay, second question. Book or books reading now?
So I usually have a couple of things going at once, fiction and non. I'm doing an interview at a big book festival of a guy named Richard Osman, who is a Brit, who's a TV presenter there, as they call them, who burst on the scene about 5 years ago with something called the Thursday Murder Club. He's written 4 of those. It's now a movie that's being made with Helen Mirren and Pierce Brosnan and da-da-da. He's very smart. They're very funny. And then he just had a book come out called We Solve Murders. It's a new series. So I'm reading his body of work, 5 books only, thank the Lord, because I'm doing an interview of him. And my nonfiction book I just started is called Book and Dagger. And it's about the importance of librarians and booksellers during World War II and how the government and the spy agencies used them for decoding and encrypting, and have wonderful reviews. I'm on page 3, but
this is newly out. Book and Dagger?
Yes, newly out about a month. Book and Dagger.
I love that. I'll get that, Book and Dagger. That sounds great to me. All right, so here's a show favorite, as you know, having watched some of the shows. Least attended book event ever.
So easy for most authors. I've got a nonfiction one and a fiction one, if I may. Nonfiction, when Sexual Violence came out, it was August of '93, and Justin, my first husband, and I were on Martha's Vineyard, where he'd been since '68, so he knew like everybody. The bookstore, Bunch of Grapes, gave me an afternoon event, and people came in, and all anybody was looking for was a beach read. I mean, that's what I wanted to write, but I hadn't written yet. And so he began just tagging people and saying, Doug, Linda's new book, and the title, Sexual Violence, on
a nice
summer afternoon.
Yeah.
And finally, he just began buying them and giving them to people that he knew. For sales, all his. And for me, the fiction just worst moment was I'd never been to a Costco, and my 3rd book came out, so it's 1999, and I'm between Boulder and Denver. Car service the publisher provides, really the elegant book tour, and the publisher called from New York and said, you're not only on the Times list, but you're in Costco, a bestseller. And I didn't know what that meant. And she said, you ought to stop and see if you can sign books. So I go to the door. They don't let you in because you're not a member. So for $125, I got my Costco membership. I went in, and they don't have them on shelves. They have a table.
Tables, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I asked the woman, nobody wanted to help me. So I find my books. I've got my own autographed sticker books. For what purpose? I don't know. So the woman just gives me a chair to sit on in front of the book table, and I'm signing my own books. And people would come by and say, "Where's the men's room? Do you know if they have any shrimp today?" Nobody had the slightest clue that I was an author. I don't think I sold any, and I didn't buy any of my own.
That's part of the Costco business model, is to make the authors get a membership to get in the store to do their event.
The non-event. So fewer sold there than anywhere.
Best ever movie courtroom scene.
Only to top Scott Turow, I would say, is Anatomy of a Murder by Robert Traver. It was a 1958 book. I think it was on the bestseller list for over a year, bestseller list. Traver was the pen name of a judge. I think his name was John Volker. And it's like Turow, it's the only book I can think of where the movie is as good as the book. Ben Gazzara, Lee Remick, Jimmy Stewart, and Otto Preminger did the score. It's a brilliant movie and a brilliant defense. It happens to be a rape. Lee Remick claimed a rape, and his question was it was a man she knew, and did he or didn't he? The courtroom scenes are among the best I've ever read, and certainly the best I've ever seen on film. And I commend
What role does Jimmy Stewart play?
Defense attorney for Ben Gazzara, and he's great. It's just there's a two-word defense. I won't say it because it's based on a real case, and it was the defense in the real case, and it worked. It's just
the
a great
two-word line
is
actually from the real case.
From the real case. It's a great book. Watch the movie. Pull up.
Start
the movie.
with a book. Start with the movie, or doesn't matter?
I would watch the movie, and it's
Anatomy
really
of a
fun.
Murder.
Yeah.
All right, I'm in. Favorite character in the Law and Order franchise?
I'm a little partial there. I mean, Stephanie March, because she played the prosecutor, and she's just a wonderful human being. Mariska, because we became really close friends, and Chris Maloney, because he's a good actor and just one of the funniest people I've ever met.
Yeah, he seems like a good New York guy. You see him in the gossip columns from time to time, but you never see anything bad about the guy. He always seems like a really...
I don't think you ever would. He's just a really good guy. And
we sat next. I went to the U.S. Open. We sat next to Mariska and her husband one time. They were super nice. I was right next to him. He was a very nice guy.
Yeah, Peter Herman.
What's going on with that franchise now? Are they still making new? Is Maloney still in it?
So he came back, I believe.
He went out
I think he went out and then went to another L&O show, I think Organized Crime or something like that. But I think they're all together again this season.
At SVU.
I think so,
good.
like season 25 or 6.
Amazing. But it's still good. You can dip into any one of those, and they're always
Absolutely.
great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, final question for Linda Fairstein. One piece of advice for the audience.
Oh, it's a two-part piece, but I think just read. If there are people out there who want to write, read anything. Just be in words as much as you can, and write. And you've got to write every day. I mean, you've probably experienced this where people come up to you at an event and say, "Well, I want to write books, but I really don't like writing. I don't have the patience to write." If you don't like it, it's not going to work.
Right.
But every day, do something. I mean, write something in a journal before you go to bed. Just write what the day has been like. And I think reading and writing are the keys to success in a career like this.
I think, and in almost everything we do is communicating, whatever you're doing, whether you're writing books or whatever. But so reading and writing are critical, really, to just life.
Yes, and a writer's life in particular.
Oh, well, Linda, cheers. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Great to
I'm
see
glad
you.
there's some left in my glass. Thank you, Doug. You do a great show.
Thanks.